In the early 15th century, a time when Europe was shaken by religious disputes and royal courts were weaving endless intrigues, a girl was born into the family of the English diplomat Thomas Boleyn. The exact date of her birth has been lost in the swirl of time. Some chroniclers point to 1501, while others lean toward 1507. This uncertainty would become symbolic of her entire life, where truth and fiction would intertwine so closely that descendants would spend centuries untangling the knot. Anne Boleyn was not born into an ordinary family. Her father, Thomas, came from a lineage where royal and merchant bloodlines had mixed. Among the girl's ancestors was King Edward I Plantagenet, whose power extended far beyond the misty shores of Albion. But there were also commoners in the family tree. Her great-grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, owned small landholdings and could not boast of noble origins. However, the Boleyns knew how to climb the social ladder. Her grandfather grew wealthy through trade, and her father, Thomas, managed to break into the circle of court nobility thanks to his diplomatic talents and a strategic marriage to Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the second Duke of Norfolk. Hever Castle in Kent became the place where Anne spent her childhood, stone walls draped in ivy, tall towers overlooking the green hills of England. Here, young Anne learned to read and write, which was a rarity even for noble girls at the time. Her father understood the value of education and spared no expense on tutors. The house resonated with French, and Latin was studied diligently. The girl grew up among books and musical instruments, absorbing the atmosphere of refined culture that Thomas Boleyn brought back from his numerous trips across Europe. Anne had a brother, George, and an older sister, Mary. The three Boleyn children were raised with the understanding that their destiny would be tied to the royal court. Their father did not hide his ambitions. He wanted his children to take a worthy place among the English elite, and this required more than just noble birth. It required connections, education, poise in courtly etiquette, and knowledge of political games. Thomas Boleyn began preparing the groundwork for his children's future long before they reached adulthood. When Anne turned about 12 or 13, her father made a decision that would determine her entire life. The girl was sent to France, to the court of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands. This was an incredible opportunity. Margaret's court was renowned throughout Europe as a center of refined culture, gathering the greatest minds, artists, poets, and musicians. Here, young women from noble families received an education that transformed them into true court ladies, capable of shining in any royal environment. Anne plunged into an entirely different world. The French language, which she had studied in England, now sounded natural and effortless around her. The girl quickly grasped the nuances of pronunciation, mastered the intricacies of court etiquette, learned to dance sophisticated dances, play the lute, and hold worldly conversations. Margaret of Austria noticed the young Englishwoman's talents and favored her. Anne spent about a year at the court of the regent of the Netherlands before her father arranged an even more advantageous placement. In 1514 or 1515, Anne was accepted into the court of the French Queen Mary Tudor, sister of the English King Henry VIII, who had married the French King Louis XII. Paris welcomed the girl with a noise, splendor, and brilliance she had never seen before. The French court of that time was the most luxurious in Europe. Here, fashion, art, gallantry, and intrigue reigned supreme. Here, Anne completed her transformation from an English girl into a sophisticated court lady with French manners. After the death of Louis XII, Mary Tudor returned to England, but Anne remained at the French court. Now, she served the new queen, Claude of France, wife of Francis I. These years were decisive in shaping her character and worldview. Anne learned to read people, understand hidden motives, and see the true intentions behind outward polish. She observed how intrigues were woven, how alliances were made and broken, and how a single wrong word could cost one their career or even their life. In France, Anne also encountered the ideas of religious reform. The Catholic Church was undergoing crises, and many educated people openly spoke of the need for change. The young woman read forbidden books, listened to theological disputes, and formed her own opinions about faith and the Church. These ideas, absorbed during her French youth, would later play a significant role in her fate and the fate of all England. In 1522, Thomas Boleyn recalled his daughter to England. Anne was about 20 years old, and her father decided the time had come to apply her education and practice. The girl who returned to England was strikingly different from the child who had left. She spoke French better than English, dressed in the latest French fashion, and possessed manners that made her noticeable in any society. Anne knew how to dance, sing, play musical instruments, engage in witty conversation, and charm interlocutors. At the English court of Henry VIII, she was accepted as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. The Spanish princess, who had become the English queen, surrounded herself with ladies-in-waiting from noble families, and Anne took her place among them. Henry's court in those years was one of the most brilliant in Europe. The young king, handsome, athletic, and educated, loved luxury, tournaments, hunting, music, and dancing. A whole world of ambitious aristocrats revolved around him, each striving to gain royal favor. Anne quickly attracted attention. Her appearance did not conform to the classical beauty standards of that time. She was dark, skinned, with dark hair and dark eyes, while the ideal was fair, skinned blondes. But there was something more to Anne than mere beauty. Her French manners, sharp wit, ability to carry on a conversation, musical talent, and a special charisma made her a magnet for male attention. Young courtiers began to revolve around her, but Anne held herself with dignity, not allowing for frivolous behavior. Meanwhile, her older sister Mary had already become King Henry's mistress. This was common practice at court. The king had numerous affairs, and the favorite was whoever could catch his attention. Mary Boleyn was beautiful but lacked wit, and quickly bored the monarch. Their affair did not bring the Boleyn family special benefits, although Thomas did receive several lucrative positions. The king treated such romances lightly, without any special obligations, and when his interest faded, the favorite quietly faded into the shadows. At court, Anne met Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, one of the most powerful aristocrats of northern England. The young people fell in love. Percy was a romantic youth who dreamed of true love, not the marriage of convenience his family was preparing for him. Anne also felt a sincere attachment to him. They began to meet in secret, making plans for the future, and soon a silent engagement emerged between them. It was a dangerous game, for marriages of the nobility were decided not by the heart, but by the political and financial interests of families. When rumors of the romance reached Percy's father, the Earl was enraged. He would not allow his son to marry a girl whose lineage, while noble, did not compare to the ancient house of Percy. The Earl turned to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's closest advisor and the de facto ruler of England. In those years, Wolsey summoned young Percy and gave him a public reprimand. The cardinal declared that Percy was already betrothed to the daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury and had no right to break that agreement. The young man was forcibly taken north, and he never saw Anne as a free person again. This separation was a heavy blow for Anne. She realized that feelings meant little at court. Here, calculation, power, and money ruled. No love could withstand the will of the powerful. This bitter truth changed something in the young woman's character. She became more cautious and calculating. She learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of courtly politeness. Anne would no longer allow herself to naively believe in romantic fairy tales. Meanwhile, events began to occur at court that would soon turn all of England upside down. King Henry, married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years, was increasingly burdened by his marriage. The main problem was the lack of a male heir. Catherine had given birth to several children, but only their daughter Mary, born in 1516, had survived. All other infants had died in infancy. For a king who dreamed of a dynasty and feared a new civil war for the throne, the lack of a male heir became an obsession. Henry began to convince himself that his marriage was cursed by God. He remembered that Catherine had previously been the wife of his older brother, Arthur, who had died in his youth. Although the Pope had granted special permission for this marriage, the king now believed that the Church had erred by acting against divine law. In the Bible, there were verses forbidding marriage to a brother's widow, and Henry clung to these words as if they were his salvation. He wanted to achieve an annulment of the marriage to gain the opportunity to marry again and produce a legitimate son. Somewhere between 1525 and 1526, King Henry VIII turned his attention to Anne Boleyn. What exactly attracted him? Historians still debate. Perhaps it was her difference from other court ladies, her French sophistication, her sharp wit, or simply the mystery she kept within herself. The king, accustomed to easy victories in love affairs, began to shower her with signs of attention. He wrote her letters, gave her gifts, and invited her to hunts and court festivities. Anne behaved in a way completely different from how other women did. She did not become his mistress. Moreover, She clearly made it understood that she did not intend to follow the example of her sister Mary, who settled for a fleeting romance without any serious consequences. Anne was smarter. She saw that the king was not just infatuated, he was obsessed, and she decided to use this obsession to get something other women could only dream of. She wanted to become not a mistress, but a queen. This game was deathly dangerous. Any misstep could lead to a fall. Anne balanced on a thin line between encouragement and refusal. She accepted the king's advances but did not allow them to cross the line. She was nearby but inaccessible. She promised but did not give. Henry, unaccustomed to refusal, fell into a true passion. The more Anne distanced herself, the more he desired her. He began to think seriously about marrying her. In 1527, the king officially began the process of annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Cardinal Wolsey received orders to obtain from the Pope a declaration that the marriage was invalid. This was no easy task. Catherine did not intend to give up without a fight. She declared that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, therefore she had married Henry as a virgin, and no violation of divine law had occurred. Moreover, behind Catherine stood her powerful nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who controlled a significant part of Europe and exerted enormous influence over Pope Clement VII. The process dragged on for years. The Pope did not want to quarrel with either Henry or Charles and tried to maneuver between them, delaying a decision. Henry was enraged by these delays. He was already over 30, time was passing, and there was still no heir. He blamed Wolsey for the inability to resolve the matter and removed the cardinal from power. Wolsey, until recently the second most powerful man in the kingdom, was arrested on charges of high treason. Only death saved him from trial and execution. He died on the way to London in 1530, broken and abandoned by everyone. Anne played her part masterfully. She influenced the king, pushing him toward more radical decisions. She introduced Henry to books by Protestant reformers who argued that the Pope did not have absolute power over Christians and that the king in his own country should be above any spiritual authority. These ideas fell on prepared soil. Henry himself was burdened by the dependence on Rome, and Anne skillfully fueled these sentiments. In 1530, Henry appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a man who shared reformist views and was personally loyal to the king. Cranmer received the position with the Pope's approval, but was in his heart an ardent supporter of the Reformation. The historical climate favored radical changes. Henry realized that the path to a new marriage lay through a break with Rome and was ready to take that step. Meanwhile, Anne was becoming more firmly established at court. The king showered her with favors, gave her lands and titles, and elevated her relatives. Anne's father received the title of Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond. Her brother George became Viscount Rochford. The Boleyn family was rapidly climbing the social ladder, and this provoked the envy and hatred of many courtiers, especially those who supported Queen Catherine and Princess Mary. The Milanese ambassador wrote in 1531 that for any influence on the English Parliament, Anne's approval was necessary. French ambassadors, as early as 1529, noted her enormous influence over the king. Anne was effectively performing the functions of a queen, while not yet holding the title. She received foreign ambassadors, intervened in state affairs, and appeared at official events beside the king. Catherine of Aragon was gradually being pushed into the background. The confrontation between the two women became a symbol of the great political and religious rift that was brewing in England. Behind Catherine stood the traditionalists, Catholics, supporters of an alliance with Spain, and submission to Rome. Behind Anne were the reformers, those who wanted the independence of England, the strengthening of royal power, and changes in the church. This conflict went far beyond a personal drama. It touched the fate of the entire country, and Henry VIII found himself at the center of this whirlpool, driven by passion for a woman and a thirst for an heir. By the beginning of 1532, King Henry's patience had completely run out. He no longer intended to wait for the Pope's decision. Events began to unfold with dizzying speed. The Parliament of England passed a series of laws that gradually undermined Rome's power over the English Church. The clergy had to recognize the king as their supreme protector and head of the Church in England. This was a revolutionary step that no Christian monarch in Europe had taken since the schism with Constantinople. By this time, Anne Boleyn no longer hid her triumph. She knew that victory was near. The king had made his choice, and nothing could make him retreat. Henry was a stubborn, self-willed man accustomed to getting his way at any cost. The idea that some distant pope in Rome could dictate to him, the King of England, how he should live and whom he should marry became unbearable to him. Anne only poured oil on the fire, but the fire was already raging in Henry's soul. Somewhere in late 1532 or early 1533, Anne finally yielded to the king. She became pregnant. This changed everything. Henry could no longer delay. He needed a legitimate wife and a legitimate heir. In January 1533, the king and Anne secretly married. The ceremony was conducted in a small circle without pomp or publicity. Formally, Henry was still married to Catherine, but for him, that marriage no longer existed. In March of the same year, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, convened an ecclesiastical court. Henry officially presented his arguments against the marriage to Catherine. Cranmer, obedient to the king's will, delivered his ruling. The marriage of Henry and Catherine was invalid because it contradicted divine law. Catherine was no longer queen. She was the Dowager Princess of Wales, the widow of Prince Arthur. Her daughter Mary was declared illegitimate and stripped of her rights to the throne. This decision split England. Many believed Catherine and considered her the true queen. The common people loved the Spaniard for her piety, dignity, and fortitude. Anne, meanwhile, was considered an upstart, a homewrecker, and almost a witch who had bewitched the king. At court, they whispered about her dark eyes, a birthmark on her neck, and an extra finger on her hand, though the latter was pure slander. But rumors multiplied, creating an atmosphere of mystical fear and hatred around Anne. On the 1st of June 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned in Westminster Abbey as Queen Consort of England. The ceremony was magnificent and solemn. Anne walked along the crimson carpet in a robe of ermine with her hair flowing, as was customary for the crowning of queens. On her head was placed the crown of St. Edward, with which monarchs were usually crowned, not their spouses. This was unprecedented. Henry wanted to show everyone that Anne was not just a wife, but a full-fledged queen. But the celebration was marred by the fact that many noble lords and ladies demonstratively did not appear at the ceremony. Among the people, the coronation evoked silent disapproval rather than joy. Londoners looked at the procession sullenly. Here and there, insulting shouts could be heard. Anne felt this coldness but held herself proudly. She had achieved her goal. She had become the Queen of England. True, the price of this victory turned out to be higher than she could have assumed. In March 1534, Parliament passed the First Act of Succession. According to this law, Princess Mary was officially recognized as illegitimate, as she was born into the sinful cohabitation of Henry and Catherine of Aragon. The heir to the throne became Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, the only legitimate queen. All subjects were required to swear allegiance to this law. Refusal threatened charges of high treason and the death penalty. On the 7th of September 1533, Anne gave birth. The astrologers had predicted a boy. Documents had been prepared with the announcement of the birth of a prince, but a girl was born. The king did not hide his disappointment. He gave Anne a restrained congratulation and left for a hunt. The girl was named Elizabeth in honor of Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. No one could have predicted then that this little princess would one day become the greatest queen in English history. The king wanted an heir who would continue the Tudor dynasty and ensure the stability of the kingdom. The whole point of the break with Rome, this entire grand upheaval, had been undertaken for the sake of a son, and Anne had failed to provide one. From that moment, the new queen's position began to slowly but steadily weaken. Having become queen, Anne Boleyn quickly discovered that power did not bring happiness. She was surrounded by enemies, both open and hidden. The old aristocracy, considering the Boleyns upstarts, bared their teeth. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary hated the new queen with all their hearts. Catholics saw her as a heretic who had destroyed the unity of the church. The common people blamed her for the country's troubles. Even at court, among those who outwardly showed respect, many secretly dreamed of her fall. Anne tried to strengthen her position by distributing positions and favors to her supporters. She actively intervened in politics, which was unusual for a queen consort. Most queens stayed in the shadows, occupied with charity and the bearing of heirs. But Anne was different. She participated in council meetings, received ambassadors, and expressed opinions on matters of foreign and domestic policy. Some admired this, others were irritated. It did not befit a woman to meddle in men's affairs, they believed. The king, in the first months of the marriage, had been in love and allowed Anne much. But gradually the passion began to cool. Henry was a fickle man in his affections. The novelty had dulled. The mystery was solved, and Anne became a normal wife, who, moreover, had not given him a son. The king began to cast eyes at other court ladies. Anne noticed this and flew into a rage. She staged scenes of jealousy, reproached Henry, and demanded loyalty. This was a mistake. Henry did not tolerate being told what to do, and every such quarrel distanced him from his wife. Meanwhile, the political situation in Europe was becoming ever more tense. Pope Clement VII excommunicated Henry from the church. This meant that any Catholic monarch could attack England without fearing sin. Emperor Charles V and the French King Francis I ended their enmity and began negotiations. There was a real threat that they would unite for a crusade against heretical England. Henry was nervous. He strengthened the army and navy, formed alliances, and sought support from German Protestant princes. Within the country, things were also restless. The church reformation initiated by the king faced resistance. Many priests and monks did not want to recognize Henry as the head of the church. Arrests and executions of dissenters began. The most famous victims were Thomas More, former Lord Chancellor and an outstanding humanist, and John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester. Both had refused to swear to the Act of Succession recognizing Anne as queen. Both were charged with high treason and executed in the summer of 1535. Their executions shocked Europe. Thomas More was known as one of the most enlightened people of his time, author of the famous Utopia, and a friend of Erasmus of Rotterdam. Anne was blamed for these executions. It was said that she demanded the deaths of those who refused to recognize her as queen. Perhaps there was a grain of truth in this. Anne did not forgive enemies and did not know how to forget insults, but the decision was made by the king. And Henry, in these years, was ruthless to everyone who dared to contradict his will. He had ceased to be the merry, generous monarch he had been in his youth. Power, paranoia, and fear of conspiracies had turned him into a tyrant. In 1535, Anne became pregnant again. This instilled hope. Perhaps this time a boy would be born. But in January 1536, the queen lost the child. This happened on the very day Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, who had died in exile and disgrace, was buried. The coincidence turned out to be ominous. Courtiers whispered that this was a sign of God's wrath. Worst of all was that Anne had lost a boy. Henry was enraged. He accused his wife of having deceived his expectations. From that moment on, Anne's position became critical. The king had cooled to her completely. He openly courted Jane Seymour, a quiet, modest lady-in-waiting, and the complete opposite of Anne. Jane was a pale blonde with meek manners. She did not stage scenes, did not meddle in politics, and did not irritate the king with wit or independence. Henry was tired of Anne. He wanted peace, and, of course, a son. Anne felt the ground slipping out from under her feet, but she could do nothing. The circle around her was tightening. The queen had a dangerous enemy in the person of Thomas Cromwell, the king's closest advisor and the de facto ruler of England after Wolsey's fall. Cromwell was a clever, cold-blooded pragmatist, a master of political intrigue. At first, he had supported Anne, seeing her as an ally in the cause of church reformation. But now he realized that the queen had become a burden to the king. Henry wanted to get rid of her. But how? Divorce was impossible, for then he would have to admit that the second marriage was also invalid, meaning the entire break with Rome had been in vain. Only one way remained. Cromwell began to weave the net into which the queen was to fall. In the spring of 1536, Thomas Cromwell began implementing his plan. He needed to collect evidence against Anne Boleyn that would allow him to accuse her of high treason, and treason by the queen automatically meant the death penalty. Cromwell was a master of his craft. He knew how to extract testimony, how to intimidate witnesses, and how to present the innocent as criminal. The machinery of repression began to work. First, several court musicians and servants close to the queen were taken into custody. They were interrogated with passion, demanded to tell about Anne's behavior, her conversations, and her meetings with court cavaliers. Under pressure, some began to say what they were wanted to hear. Yes, the queen sometimes received young men in her chambers. Yes, she danced with them, laughed, and flirted. This was all ordinary court behavior, but now every gesture and every word took on a sinister meaning. On April 29, during a May tournament, Henry suddenly left the stands and left Greenwich without saying a word to Anne. The Queen remained alone, not understanding what was happening. The next day, April 30, Mark Smeaton, a court musician, a talented lutenist from a common family who had made a career thanks to his art, was arrested. He was accused of adultery with the Queen. After torture, Smeaton confessed. Historians believe the confession was false, extracted by threats and pain, but for Cromwell, this did not matter. The first link in the chain was ready. On May 2, Anne was arrested right in the royal palace. Members of the Privy Council arrived and announced that she was accused of adultery and high treason. Anne was shocked. She denied all accusations, called them absurd, and demanded a meeting with the king, but Henry refused to see her. The Queen was led to the barge that would take her to the Tower. Anne understood that this was the end. She was being taken to the same fortress where, just 3 years earlier, she had been preparing for her coronation. Now she was entering as a criminal. Together with her, 4 other men were arrested. Henry Norris, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber and a close friend of Henry; William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber; Francis Weston, a court cavalier; and her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. All of them were accused of having a love affair with the Queen. George was also accused of incest, which was particularly monstrous. Later, another, Sir Richard Page, was arrested, but he was eventually released for lack of evidence. In the Tower, Anne was placed in the same chambers where she had spent the night before her coronation. The irony of fate was cruel. Her 4 ladies-in-waiting remained with her, tasked with watching her every word and movement. Anne cried, fell into hysterics, and tried to reason logically, proving the absurdity of the accusations. All her words were recorded and passed to Cromwell. He searched them for even the slightest confirmation of guilt, but Anne gave no such confessions. The accusations were monstrous. Anne was accused of entering into criminal relations with 5 men, and some of these relationships were dated to the time when she was pregnant with Princess Elizabeth. She was charged with planning the king's death in order to marry one of them and raise him to the throne. This was high treason in its purest form. If the charges had been confirmed, Anne would have faced a painful death by burning at the stake. On May 12, the trial began for Norris, Brereton, Weston, Smeaton, and George Boleyn. Everyone except Smeaton denied their guilt, but the verdict was predetermined. All 5 were found guilty and sentenced to death. They were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, as was the custom for traitors. But Henry mitigated the sentence to beheading. This was the only mercy he showed them. On May 15, the trial of Anne herself took place. She was tried in the Great Hall of the Tower. Among the 26 judges was her former lover, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and her own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Percy felt ill during the trial and lost consciousness several times. Howard conducted the proceedings coolly, showing no emotion. Kinship did not matter. Loyalty to the king was more important. Anne held herself with dignity. She refuted every accusation, proved their inconsistency, and spoke persuasively and passionately. Many of those present were struck by her courage, but the outcome was predetermined. The judges unanimously found her guilty. The Duke of Norfolk read the verdict. Anne Boleyn is guilty of high treason and adultery. She is sentenced to death by burning at the stake or beheading at the king's will. Anne listened to the verdict calmly and delivered a short speech in which she again declared her innocence, but added that she was ready to accept God's will. After the verdict was announced, Anne was returned to her chambers in the Tower. She knew that she had very little time left to live. On May 17, 2 days after her trial, the 5 men accused of connection with her were executed. Mark Smeaton was hanged as a commoner. The 4 noblemen were beheaded by an axe on Tower Hill, a public place of execution near the fortress. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, climbed the scaffold with dignity. In his last speech he admitted that he was sinful, as all people are, but did not specify in what exactly. He was the first to be executed. When Anne was told of her brother's death, she wept, but quickly pulled herself together. Henry wanted to be finished with everything as quickly as possible. He had already proposed to Jane Seymour and was planning the wedding. But first, it was necessary to legally solidify the break with Anne. On May 17, the day of the execution of the 5 accused, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared the marriage of Henry and Anne invalid. The basis for this was that Henry had previously had an affair with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, and church canons forbade marriage to close relatives of a mistress. This was absurdity of the highest order. It turned out that Anne had not been a legal wife, but she was tried and executed as a queen for treason against a husband who, according to the church's decision, was not her husband. Princess Elizabeth, like Mary before her, was declared illegitimate. Anne accepted this news with bitterness. She asked for only one thing: that her daughter should not suffer. Elizabeth was only 2 years and 8 months old. The girl was left an orphan, stripped of her title, and rejected by her father. Anne understood that she could do nothing to help her daughter, but she prayed that the Lord would protect the child. These prayers perhaps were heard. Elizabeth would survive, overcome all storms and dangers, and one day become the great queen who would rule England for 45 years. Henry ordered that Anne's execution be carried out not by an axe, but by a sword. This was a sign of royal mercy. The sword was considered a more noble instrument, and an execution by sword was faster and cleaner than by axe. For this, an experienced executioner, a master of his craft, was summoned from the French city of Calais. The king wanted Anne not to suffer. Perhaps in the depths of his soul, he still remembered how he had loved this woman, although now he hated her for not meeting his expectations. On May 18, Anne was told that the execution would take place the next day at noon. She spent her last night in prayer. A priest was with her, to whom she confessed and took communion. Anne swore several times on the holy sacraments that she was innocent, that she had never betrayed the king. The priest believed her. Many of those who were near her in these last hours also believed her, but it did not matter. The verdict had been rendered, and the king wanted to see Anne dead. On the morning of May 19, Anne rose early. She dressed in a modest gray dress with a white collar, a white underskirt, and a dark coif. She tucked her hair under the coif so that her neck was open. She was calm, even cheerful. Death no longer frightened her. Anne knew that it would soon end, and this brought relief. She asked for communion again and swore to her innocence once more. The execution was to take place on Tower Green, inside the fortress courtyard, not publicly. This was also a privilege. Usually, traitors were executed in front of a huge crowd, turning the execution into a public spectacle. Anne, as a queen, was granted the honor of dying in relative privacy. Only high officials, representatives of the nobility, and a few specially invited guests were present. The common people were not allowed in. The scaffold was built specifically for this execution. It was low, covered with black cloth. Nearby lay straw to soak up the blood. The executioner from Calais was already waiting, dressed in black with a long two-handed sword. His face was not covered by a mask, as English executioners did. The French were not ashamed of their profession. This man was a professional of the highest class, capable of taking a head off with one precise stroke. Around 9:00 a.m., earlier than the appointed time, Anne was led from her chambers. She was accompanied by the constable, Sir William Kingston, and 4 ladies-in-waiting. Anne walked with a firm step, showing no fear. She climbed the scaffold and addressed the small crowd gathered there with a final speech. By tradition, the condemned could not speak anything against the king or the sentence. Otherwise, the execution would be immediately interrupted, and the wretch led away for torture. Anne spoke in a firm voice. She was pale but held herself with royal dignity. Her words were carefully weighed. She could not directly state her innocence, could not accuse the king, could not put her daughter in danger. Everything she said was dictated by the necessity of protecting Elizabeth. Good Christian people, I have come here to die, for by law I am condemned to die. Therefore, I shall say nothing against this. I have come here not to accuse anyone or to speak of that for which I am condemned, but I pray God to save the king and grant him long to reign over you. For a more merciful and kind sovereign there was never. To me, he was always a kind, merciful, and generous Lord. If anyone takes it upon themselves to discuss my case, I ask them to judge me by the best. And so, I bid farewell to the world and to you all, and I heartily ask you all to pray for me. These words sounded of submission, but many heard in them a bitter irony, a merciful and kind sovereign who sent an innocent woman to her death. Anne was playing the last role of her life, and she played it brilliantly. She did not give her enemies a reason to gloat over her weakness. She was dying a queen, albeit stripped of her crown. After the speech, Anne took off her coif. A lady-in-waiting gave her a white bandage with which to cover her eyes. Anne asked the girls to help her remove her hair so that her neck was fully exposed. She feared that the executioner might miss if the hair got in the way. The ladies-in-waiting cried, but Anne calmed them. She said she had a thin neck and everything would be quick. She even smiled, grasping her neck with her hands, demonstrating how small it was. The executioner stood aside. He specifically did not show the sword, so as not to scare the condemned woman ahead of time. When Anne stood on her knees on the straw, he gave a signal to his assistant. The assistant loudly called out to someone, distracting Anne's attention. She instinctively turned her head in that direction. At that moment, the executioner stepped forward, raised the sword, and with one lightning-fast stroke, severed the queen's head. Anne did not even have time to understand what had happened. Death came instantly, without pain, without agony. It was about 9:00 a.m. on the 19th of May, 1536. Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII, Queen of England, was about 30 years old. She lived a short but incredibly bright life. She changed the history of an entire country. Because of her, England broke with Rome. The Reformation began, and the foundation of the future Church of England was laid. Anne's body and her head were placed in an old arrow crate found in the Tower. They did not even prepare a coffin for her. She was buried right there, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, located on the territory of the Tower. The grave was not marked, and the exact burial site was not recorded. Only in the 19th century, during restoration work, were the remains of several women executed in the Tower discovered, and one of them was attributed to Anne Boleyn. The remains were reburied with honors, and a memorial plaque with names was installed. The 20th century brought a new wave of interest in Anne Boleyn. They wrote novels, filmed movies, staged performances, and her image was romanticized. Anne was depicted as a victim of love, as a woman who dared to challenge the system, as a fighter for her rights in a world where women had no rights. Feminists saw in her a predecessor, albeit a tragic one. Anne became an icon of popular culture, the heroine of countless biographies and works of art. Almost 500 years have passed since the execution of Anne Boleyn, but the disputes about her do not subside. Each new generation of historians revises her fate, trying to understand who she really was and to separate the truth from centuries-old layers of myths and legends. Modern researchers have access to documents that their predecessors did not have. They apply new methods of analysis, use scientific achievements for dating and checking sources. Thanks to these studies, we now know more about Anne than even her contemporaries knew. We can reconstruct the chronology of her life, understand the motives of her actions, and evaluate her influence on history. And yet, much remains a mystery. We do not know exactly when she was born. We do not know if she loved King Henry or simply used his passion to achieve power. We do not know what she thought in the last minutes before the execution, when she stood on her knees waiting for the stroke of the blade. One thing can be said for certain. Anne Boleyn was an outstanding personality. She possessed the intelligence, will, and charisma that allowed her to rise from a simple lady-in-waiting to the Queen of England. This was an incredible ascent for a woman of the 16th century, when the fates of women were determined by men, fathers, brothers, husbands. Anne tried to take her destiny into her own hands, and for a time, she succeeded. But in the end, the system proved stronger. A woman could not win in a game whose rules were written by men. Contemporary historians almost unanimously reject the accusations against Anne. There was no evidence of her adultery either then or now. The dates of the alleged adulteries do not coincide with the real movements of Anne and the accused men. Many of them were simply not in the places where the meetings supposedly took place. The testimony of the witnesses contradicted each other in common sense. Mark Smeaton's confession was extracted by torture and was not confirmed by anything other than the words of the unfortunate musician himself. Henry VIII was obsessed with the idea of a dynasty. He feared that after his death, a new war for the throne would begin, similar to the one that had tormented England in the 15th century during the Wars of the Roses. He needed a son, a legitimate heir, whom no one could challenge. Catherine of Aragon did not give him a son, and Anne Boleyn did not either. This meant a third attempt was needed, and for this, it was necessary to get rid of Anne. A divorce was impossible. Henry had already divorced Catherine, or rather, achieved an annulment. If he had tried to divorce Anne, it would have undermined the entire logic of the break with Rome. It would mean the king had entered into illegal marriages twice, and therefore his power over the church, his title as Supreme Head of the Church of England, would lose its legitimacy. Henry could not allow this. It remained to eliminate Anne physically, but to find a legal basis for this, Thomas Cromwell developed a plan that simultaneously rid the king of his tiresome wife and strengthened royal power. By accusing Anne of treason, it could be shown that no one was above the law, that even the queen would answer for a crime. This was meant to intimidate the courtiers and demonstrate how dangerous it was to oppose Henry's will. The execution of Anne and the 5 men accused with her became a warning to everyone, but there was another motive. Cromwell and Anne by that time had become political rivals. They disagreed on views of foreign policy and the pace of church reform. Anne supported an alliance with France and the rapid advancement of reforms. Cromwell leaned toward an alliance with German Protestant princes and a more cautious approach. The Queen tried to influence the king against Cromwell. He understood that only one of them could remain, and he struck first. By eliminating Anne, he strengthened his own position, though it helped him for only a short time. 4 years later, Henry executed Cromwell himself on charges of high treason. The memory of Anne Boleyn survived the centuries thanks to her daughter. The reign of Elizabeth I became the golden age of England, and historians could not bypass the mother of the great queen. Each biography of Elizabeth inevitably included the story of Anne. Every account of the Reformation in England mentioned her role. Anne entered history not as a villain or a saint, but as a complex, contradictory personality whose life was at the center of grandiose historical events. Today, almost 500 years later, we can assess Anne Boleyn's significance for the history of England. Without her, perhaps there would have been no break with Rome, or at least it would have happened later and in a different form. Without her, there would have been no Queen Elizabeth, which means the history of England and the whole world would have unfolded differently. Elizabethan England would not have defeated the Spanish Armada, would not have begun the colonization of the New World, would not have given the world Shakespeare and the theater of the Renaissance. Anne Boleyn lived a short life, was queen for only 3 years, but her influence on history proved to be enormous. She was a woman who dared to challenge the established order, achieved the impossible, and paid the highest price for it. Her story became a warning and an inspiration for many generations. She showed that a woman could be not just an ornament at court, not just a tool for dynastic marriages, but a full-fledged political player capable of influencing the fates of states. On May 19 of each year, a memorial service is held in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London. It is conducted in memory of those who were executed and buried there without proper honors. Among the names commemorated, the name of Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, beheaded by order of her own husband at the age of about 30, is always heard. Her grave is marked by a simple slab in the chapel. Thousands of tourists come here to pay their respects to the memory of the woman who changed history. The story of Anne Boleyn reminds us of the fragility of power, the price of ambition, and the cruelty of political games. It shows how the personal passion of a king can turn the fate of an entire country. It demonstrates that there are no absolute heroes and villains in history. There are only people with their desires, fears, weaknesses, and strengths. Anne was such a woman. She dreamed of power and obtained it. She wanted love and found passion. She hoped for a son but gave birth to a daughter who exceeded all her expectations. The last look of Anne, when she knelt on the scaffold, was turned to the sky. She repeated the prayer, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." These were the last words those standing nearby heard. In a moment, the sword fell, and it was all over. Anne Boleyn left this world as swiftly and dramatically as she had lived. Her earthly story was finished, but the story of her memory, her influence, and her legacy was only beginning. And this story continues to this day. As long as people remember the name of the woman who was Queen of England for only 1,000 days, but changed the country forever.